Welcome to episode 2 of the Python Basics series. In this video, we're going to actually start coding. We're going to learn how to print text to the user, how to define variables, and basic data types in Python. So firstly, let's go over how we can display text to the user inside the output window. In order to do that, we can make use of Python's built-in print function. This lets us print text to the console, and the user can view the console, so the print function serves as a way to help us display text to users who run our code. And it takes a string as an argument, or a value that's passed into the print function. And a string is basically just the programming term for text, and it can be surrounded by double or single quotes. And so the syntax for printing text is firstly print all in lowercase, and then a pair of parentheses, and then inside those parentheses, the text that you want to print surrounded by double or single quotes. That syntax might actually look familiar, as it's exactly the same way that we wrote code for printing out hello world at the end of the previous video. You can see the name of the function, print, and then parentheses with the text hello world inside. And so these quotes are actually really important because they tell the Python interpreter that this is actually a string, and the text inside it should actually just be interpreted literally as just the text inside the quotes, and that no calculation should be made, and it should just take the text and directly print it out to the console. And the parentheses are also important because they signify that this string here, this piece of text, is actually being passed into the print function as a value. So if we were to remove the parentheses, then you can see it shows that we have a syntax error because we need parentheses in order to actually call or invoke the print function. The quotes are also required because they signal to the interpreter that this is actually a piece of text. So if we get rid of them, then you can see it gives us a syntax error saying this syntax is invalid. So that's why we need the quotes in order to actually run this code. Now that we know how to print text to the console, let's now learn the next concept, which is variables. So variables are basically ways in programming to store data so that you can reuse it later. They're basically like buckets for a real world analogy, and these buckets in the real world hold specific objects. In Python or programming, these objects are actually values that the variables actually contain. And so you can use variables to store a specific value and then reuse it in later parts of the code throughout your code. Before we actually start using a variable, it's important to come up with an appropriate name for it. And so some tips on naming a variable include making sure that it's short so that we can easily access it, while also keeping the name descriptive so that we don't forget what the variable's actually used for. Going on to rules of naming variables now, you could use uppercase or lowercase letters underscores and numbers in a variable name. However, you can't start the variable name with a number. And the convention in Python for naming variables is known as snake case, where you use lowercase variable names where words are separated using underscores. In order to use a variable in Python, firstly, we need to type the name of the variable. So in this example, I'm going to save my username in a variable. So I'll just type user underscore name. And you can see the snake case being used here, an underscore used to separate lowercase user and lowercase name. And then we have to type an equal sign and then a specific value. So in this case, the username is a string. So I'm going to create a string using double quotes, and I'll type my username, Dr. Rman, in there. However, when we run this code, you can see it doesn't do anything. And that's because all we did in this file, in this code right here, is just define a variable called user underscore name. We don't actually do anything with it. So let's say we wanted to print it out to the console. So what we could do is use the print function again, but this time instead of typing text in quotes, we can type in the username by directly typing user underscore name. And so we don't need quotes because we want this to resolve to this variable that we created here, not just the text user underscore name. And so when we run it now, you can see the username Dr. Rman is printed out. However, let's say now I want to change my username. Well, I can just type in the same variable username, and then I can use equals to reassign it. So, for example, I can change it to Dr. Rman 25. And then, just to truly check that the value has changed, I can print the username again. And now if we run the file, you can see both the initial username, Dr. Rman, is printed out, and the new username is also printed out on a separate line. Right now, we're only using a variable to store text. However, there are other units of data available for us to use in Python that we can store in a variable and use. So the first one that we already went over is a string which contains text, as we discussed and talked about earlier. The next three that we're going to look at in this video are integers, which are numbers without decimals, floating point values, which are numbers with decimals, and booleans, which are just true or false values. So now let's actually try to use some of these new data types. So firstly, let's try using an integer. So we can create an integer variable. A real world example would likely be a number of points inside of a game. So this variable can be called num points. And then we can set it equal to something like 50. And then we can print out that num points variable to the console. And then you can see that 50 prints out. Next, let's move on to floating point variables. And so a real world example would probably be a number like pi, an approximation of a number like pi. So I can just say pi equals, and then you can do the first two decimal places here, so 3.14, and then now we can print out pi, and then if we run it, you can see 3.14 is printed out as a decimal number. And finally, let's move on to booleans now. So a boolean is basically a true or false value, or in the real world, it could be interpreted as a yes or no answer. So one possible scenario where a boolean value could be useful is whether I've subscribed to this YouTube channel or not. So I can name this variable is subscribed, or simply just subscribed if I wanted to. And then let's start out by saying false, so I haven't subscribed. And then if we were to print out subscribe, so we can see the value, what it looks like when printed out, you can see it prints out false. However, let's say we changed it so that we click the subscribe button and we're now subscribed to the channel. So that means subscribed is now equal to true. And then we can print it out again. And then you can see subscribed was initially false, and that's what was printed out. But later on, we did subscribe, and then the variable was set to true, and then true was printed out as a result. So the important thing with Boolean values is that the T in true or F in false, the first letter of a Boolean always has to be capitalized. If we were to just do lowercase true and lowercase false, you can see that it creates an error because Python doesn't know how to interpret these lowercase false and true. When implementing or simulating a specific real-world scenario in Python, it's important to think about the appropriate data type that you'll use in order to more accurately convey or store the data. So, for example, if you wanted to store something like a username, which is text, then you'd use a string. However, if you wanted to store something like a whole number, like the number of attempts in a game, then you'd use an integer, or int as Python calls it. And if you wanted to store something like an approximation of an irrational number, like pi or e, then you'd use a float, and a Boolean if it's just a simple yes or no question. For a challenge that combines everything that we learned in this episode, define 3 variables for if you enjoy ice cream or not, what your favorite school subject is, and the plastic ratio rounded to 3 decimal places, and then print them out. As a final extra challenge that combines everything we learned in this episode, try on your own to define 3 variables for if you enjoy ice cream, your favorite subject in school, and the plastic ratio rounded to 3 decimal places, and print them out to the console. And your output that you print to the console should look something like what's in yellow. This concludes episode 2 of the Python Basics series. Thank you very much for watching. Make sure to like the video and subscribe if you enjoyed it. And be on the lookout for episode 3, which is coming soon.